At 42, I, John Foster, an Emmy winning documentary filmmaker known for my hard hitting exposes, thought I'd seen it all when it came to human nature. 3 Emmy Awards for uncovering corruption, 20 years of ripping masks off the most powerful people in the country, hundreds of interviews with criminals and their victims. I believed nothing could surprise me anymore. Boy, was I wrong. My wife Sarah, a 35-year-old aspiring actress, was about to teach me a lesson that would turn my world upside down. And Mark Hendricks, one of Hollywood's most influential producers, would become the catalyst in a story where I was destined to play the leading role, not the one they had planned for me, but rather the director of their downfall. The first warning bell rang 6 months ago. Sarah, my wife and mother of our 16-year-old daughter Emily, suddenly became obsessed with reviving her acting career. I supported her. Why not? After 15 years of marriage, I figure I owed her the chance to pursue her long-held dream. Emily was old enough now. My career was stable, perfect timing for new adventures. Johnny, darling, you can't imagine the opportunities opening up. Her eyes sparkled as she talked about the auditions. Golden Gate Studios is looking for fresh faces, and Mark Hendricks himself is conducting the casting calls. I smiled, listening to her enthusiastic stories, kept smiling when she started staying out later for business meetings, smiled while watching her wardrobe transform, increasingly revealing outfits, more expensive jewelry, smiled until I could barely recognize my own wife anymore. The anxiety didn't hit all at once. At first, it was just little things. A new perfume she'd never worn before, strange pauses in phone conversations when I entered the room, inexplicable business dinners on weekends. Then came the roles, without auditions, without competition, as if by magic. It's pure talent, sweetheart, she chirped. Mark says I have a special energy, a natural magnetism. Mark. Not Mr. Hendricks, not the producer, just Mark. When had she gotten on a first name basis with someone whose name she'd uttered with such reverence just weeks ago? And now here I stood in the Ritz-Carlton, clutching my phone with a message from Mike Donovan, my cameraman and best friend of 15 years. John, you need to see this. Right now, second floor, Celestial Harbor Restaurant. I'm at the bar. Something in his voice, tense, strained, made me drop everything and drive over. Mike wasn't one to cry wolf. If he said, need to see, it was damn well important. The restaurant greeted me with dim lighting and soft jazz. I spotted Mike at the bar, haggard and untouched whiskey in front of him. He silently nodded toward the far corner of the room. The first thing I saw was her black dress, the one I'd given her on our last anniversary. Versus your favorite designer, she'd said then. A $4,000 dress, my way of saying I love you after 15 years of marriage. And now it hugged her figure in the restaurant's half-light, where she sat with another man. Mark Hendricks looked exactly like a Hollywood producer should. Impeccable Tom Ford suit, platinum Rolex, the confident posture of a man used to getting whatever he wants. His hand rested on her knee, a possessive, casual gesture. They were talking, and Sarah was laughing, that special laugh that used to be reserved just for me. They've been here for an hour, Mike said quietly. I was shooting an interview for your big pharma corruption piece. Caught them by accident. I watched as Hendricks leaned in toward her, as his hand slid higher up her thigh, as she moved in for a kiss. Passionate, nothing like our recent perfunctory goodnight pecks. Something inside me died at that moment, but something else, cold, calculating, professional, awoke. How long? My voice sounded surprisingly calm. Can't say for sure, but Mike hesitated. Word around the studio is all her roles came through his bedroom. Every single one. And she's not the first, John. He's got a whole system going. System. That word triggered a familiar professional itch. For 20 years, I've been exposing systems, corruption schemes, criminal conspiracies, power plays. And now fate had thrown a new investigation my way. I didn't make a scene. Didn't storm over to their table. Didn't start shouting or throwing dishes. Instead, I pulled out my phone and dialed my editor. Pete. Clear my schedule for the next month. We've got a new project. What's the story this time? His voice carried that familiar professional curiosity. Working title: Hollywood's Dark Side. I watched as Hendrix helped Sarah with her coat. A story about how producers turn dreams into nightmares, about a system where roles are bought with bodies, not talent, about betrayal, greed, and retribution. Sounds hot, Pete whistled, but it's dangerous territory, boss. These guys have connections, money, and I've got a camera and 20 years of experience digging up dirt. I smiled, watching the valet bring around Hendrix Bentley. And you know what? We're gonna make one hell of a film about it. The following weeks turned into a hunt. I worked like a man possessed, gathering evidence piece by piece. Every evening, Sarah would ask about my new project. I'd tell her, in detail with relish, about corruption in the film industry, about producers who abused their position, about how vital it was to expose them. Honey, maybe you shouldn't. Concern crept into her voice. It's Hollywood. Everyone's got secrets. That's exactly why the truth needs to come out. I kissed her temple, catching the scent of unfamiliar cologne. You'll support me in this, won't you? Like always? She nodded, and I noticed her hands trembling. That evening, I accidentally overheard her phone conversation. Mark, he suspects something. No, I'm not sure. Yes, some film about the industry. Of course, I'll find out everything. I smiled. Act 1 of my story had begun. They didn't know it yet, but they'd already become the lead characters in a film that would be their last role in Hollywood. My studio transformed into an operation command center. The walls were covered with photographs, documents, testimonies. Mike worked like a demon, gathering more evidence, recorded conversations, bank statements, testimonies from Hendrix's other victims. And Sarah unwittingly became my primary informant. Every conversation, every meeting, every careless word, everything was documented, becoming part of the future exposing. She'd tell me about her creative plans, new projects, about what a brilliant producer Hendrix was. At night, I edited the footage, turning their dirty secrets into a story that would shake Hollywood to its core. Every frame, every cut was infused with the cold fury that had replaced love in my heart. They wanted to make me a victim. Well, I become the director of their downfall, and I swear this would be my finest film yet. In the world of documentary filmmaking, there's an unwritten rule. The real story begins where the obvious ends. The first 2 weeks of investigation confirmed my worst fears. Sarah's affair was just the tip of the iceberg. Each new piece of evidence, every victim's testimony transformed my personal tragedy into a massive expose of a criminal system that had infected the entire film industry. Mike dropped the first bombshell on a chilly November morning. A thick folder of bank statements landed on my desk like a death sentence. Check out the dates. His voice was hollow. Every major transfer lines up with a new star getting a leading role, including Sarah. I flipped through the documents, feeling ice-cold rage building inside. 20 grand for a pilot episode role, 50 grand for a feature film lead, 100 grand for a trilogy contract, all through shell companies, all disguised as consulting fees. That's not all. Mike pulled out a flash drive. Remember Laura Page? Last season's rising star. The one who suddenly quit the business. She didn't quit. They forced her out. Here's her testimony. The video was shot in some run-down motel. Laura, once glamorous on red carpets, looked worn down. Her hands shook as she told her story. At first, it was like a fairy tale. Her voice cracked. Mark promised me the moon and stars, said I was special. Then came the special contract conditions. When I refused, they destroyed me. Spread rumors about drug addiction, set me up with fake prescriptions. In one day, every door slammed shut. I watched the footage over and over, noting details, writing down names. Every word Laura spoke found confirmation in other sources. The story repeated itself with frightening regularity. Young actresses, big promises, special conditions, and then complete destruction of those who dared to say no. I need more. I turned to Mike. Find others. Everyone who's willing to talk. They came forward one by one. Jessica Monroe, whose alcohol problem coincided with her refusal to attend private meetings with the producer. Emma Wright, who got caught with forged documents after threatening to tell Hendricks' wife everything. Dozens of broken lives, dozens of stories written from the same playbook. Then Emily, my 16-year-old daughter, unexpectedly entered the game. She'd inherited my talent for directing and was already making her first steps in documentary filmmaking, shooting short films for the school festival. Dad, can I help with the editing? She peeked into the studio late one evening. I saw the rough cuts on your computer. It's it's powerful stuff. I hesitated. Should I involve my daughter in this dirty story? But her eyes burned with the same fire that once ignited me, a passion for truth, a desire to dig deep. This is dangerous territory, sweetheart. I know, she sat beside me. And I know about Mom. Saw her with that producer. My heart skipped a beat. Of course she knew. Emily had always been observant, like a true director. That's why I want to help. She squeezed my hand. They need to answer for this, for everyone they've broken. Her involvement proved invaluable. Emily brought a fresh perspective to the editing, catching details I'd missed. More importantly, her presence in the studio provided the perfect cover for my obsession with work. You're coming home so late. Sarah tried to mask her anxiety with faint concern. Maybe you should take a break. Can't do that. I smiled my new, cold smile. Emily's so passionate about the project. You know how important it is to nurture her interest in directing. It was a new level in our psychological game. I used her own weapon, lying for the sake of family. Every evening, I'd share updates about the film's progress, carefully measuring details, watching her grow pale at the mention of certain names. You won't believe who I met today. Laura Page, I casually dropped during dinner. She's got quite a story about Hollywood's behind-the-scenes life. Sarah would drop her fork, and an hour later, I'd accidentally overhear her hysterical whisper into the phone. Mark, he talked to Laura. Yes, that Laura. What do we do? What are we going to do? And I kept digging. Each day brought new evidence. Each night turned into editing sessions of damning footage. Emily worked beside me, silently supporting my obsession with justice. The map of Hendricks' criminal empire grew on my studio wall. Bank transfers, secret meetings, victim testimonies. Everything fell into place for the perfect composition of our future film. A film that wouldn't just be an exposive, it would be a verdict for the entire system. Sarah bounced between me and her lover, clueless about how much I knew. Her calls became increasingly panicked, her meetings more nervous, and I kept playing the role of the obsessed director, blind to everything around him. Don't you think you're digging too deep? She asked one evening. Some secrets are better left buried. The truth has to come out. I looked straight into her eyes. No matter how ugly it might be. You know me, I always see things through to the end. Something in my gaze made her shudder. Perhaps she was beginning to understand that our little family drama had transformed into something much bigger. Something that couldn't be stopped anymore. Mike brought in the final piece of evidence on a rainy Tuesday. The security footage from Hendricks' private elevator showed everything. The additions that lasted minutes, the tearful exits, the predatory pattern that had destroyed countless dreams. This is it, I said, watching the timestamps match perfectly with the bank transfers. This is what ties it all together. Emily sat at the editing bay, her fingers flying over the keyboard. At 16, she had an instinct for pacing that veterans would envy. She knew exactly where to cut, how to build tension, how to make the truth impossible to ignore. You know what's crazy, Dad? She said, not looking up from the monitor. They're so convinced of their power, they don't even try to hide anymore. It's like they think they're untouchable. That's their weakness, I replied, watching the footage roll. The mighty always fall hardest when they think they're invincible. The film was taking its final shape. 3 hours of merciless exposure, backed by irrefutable evidence. Victim testimonies interwoven with financial documents. Secret recordings of Hendricks building into a portrait of a monster systematically destroying young actresses' lives. We worked through the night, fueled by coffee and righteous anger. Emily's presence kept me focused, reminded me why this fight mattered. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice, about changing a system that had destroyed too many lives. That's when the calls started. Silent ones at first. Then came the threats. "You should back off, Mr. Foster." The voice on the line oozed fake concern. "Think about your family, your daughter. Such a talented girl. It would be a shame if something happened to her." I stepped up security, installed cameras around the house and studio, hired a bodyguard for Emily, despite her protests. Then they made their move, the one they'd been building up to. It happened outside the studio. I was heading home late, reviewing footage from the latest shoot. The black SUV seemed to materialize out of nowhere. Screeching tires, impact, darkness. I woke up at the hospital. Broken bones, concussion, but alive. No leads on the vehicle, the detective reported. Fake plates, surveillance cameras in the area coincidentally malfunctioning. But they miscalculated. What should have stopped the project only accelerated its completion. Emily took over final editing while I recovered. "I'll finish this, Dad." Her voice was steel strong. They thought they could break us, but they don't know what we're made of. She worked like a woman possessed. Brought the laptop to the hospital, showed me rough cuts, consulted on structure. Between edits, she'd tell me about Mom, how she was getting increasingly nervous, whispering on long phone calls, her behavior shifting. "They're planning something for the festival," Emily said one day. I had overheard her discussing some backup plan with Hendrix. We knew the festival premiere would be the moment of truth. Hendrix had already announced his new project, a big-budget trilogy starring Sarah. They planned to present her as Hollywood's newest sensation, a star on the rise. A week before my discharge, Emily brought the final devastating piece of material. She caught them, Sarah and Hendrix, at the same restaurant where it all began. They were celebrating the contract signing, unaware that my daughter was filming a corporate event for her school project in the adjacent room. "Watch this." Emily pulled up the footage. They're not even trying to hide anymore. On screen, Hendrix raised a champagne glass. "To our new star, and to her idiot husband, who's so conveniently distracted by his little exposure." Sarah laughed, pressing against him. "He has no idea he's digging his own grave. Too bad that driver was such an amateur. Should have hit harder, not just grazed him." Hendrix winced. "Keep it down, darling." "Why?" She sipped her champagne. "I told you we should have used a truck, not that amateur hit job. He's like a damned cockroach, always crawling back. You know, her eyes flashed with drunk bravado. Maybe we should try again. Make it count this time." And this from the mother of his child. Hendrix smirked. "Oh, please," she waved dismissively. "Emily's off to college soon. New life, new opportunities. And this idealist with his principles just keeps getting in the way." Can you imagine his face when he finds out all his evidence will accidentally disappear before the premiere? If he lives to see it. Emily caught everything, every word, every gesture, with a professionalism that made me prouder than ever. "This will be the perfect ending, Dad," she smiled, editing the final frames. They wrote it themselves. The red carpet at the International Film Festival sparkled under camera flashes. I stood in the shadow of the giant screen, watching the guests arrive. Emily squeezed my hand, her first premiere as co-director. We deliberately hadn't promoted the film as an exposive. It was listed in the program under the neutral title Behind the Scenes, a Hollywood story. "They're here," Emily whispered, pointing at a black limousine. Mark Hendrix emerged first, immaculate in his Tom Ford tuxedo, radiating the confidence of a man who believes he's untouchable. Behind him came Sarah, radiant in a $30,000 Valentino gown. The jewelry she wore cost more than the annual budget of an indie film. Nervous? Mike appeared beside me, camera at the ready. For the first time in my life, not at all, I smiled, watching Hendrix pose for photographers. You know what their biggest mistake is? They're so convinced of their power that they didn't even bother to find out what exactly we filmed. The hall was packed. Critics, journalists, industry stars. Hendrix and Sarah took their seats in the VIP box. I watched her lean in to whisper something to him with a smile, probably joking about how her loser husband was trying to draw attention to his little film. The lights dimmed. The first frames appear on screen, an elegant studio logo, calm music. Nothing hinted at the storm to come. The first blow hit them 10 minutes in, when banking documents appear on screen, proving systematic bribes and critic payoffs. I saw Hendricks lean forward, his self-assured smile faltering. The second hit was harder. Testimonies from his casting victims. 20 women, 20 shattered lives. Each story backed by documents, recordings, irrefutable evidence. Dead silence filled the theater. "They're trying to leave," Emily whispered. Too late, I nodded to festival security. Doors are locked until the screening ends. On screen, Laura Page told her story. Then others followed. Hendricks' system revealed itself in all its ugly glory. Then came the segment about Sarah. I watched her turn pale as she recognized herself in recordings of secret meetings. Every frame, every phrase destroyed her carefully constructed image of a rising star. Particularly devastating was the restaurant scene. Her cynical words about the attempt on her husband's life, captured by her own daughter's skilled hand. "You," Hendricks jumped up, pointing at me. "You have no right." "Sit down, Mr. Hendricks," the jury chairman said calmly. "The film isn't over." The final was devastating. A complete dossier on Hendricks' empire, money laundering through shell companies, witness testimonies about his contract schemes, and finally, direct evidence of organizing the attempt on my life. When the lights came up, the theater was dead silent. I walked to the stage, leaning on my cane, the last reminder of that accidental hit and run. Any questions? The journalists snapped to life like sharks smelling blood. Camera flashes, shouts, questions from all directions. But I only watched two people in the audience. Hendricks tried to push his way to the exit, but they were waiting for him, FBI agents investigating financial crimes. Sarah sat motionless, her hands limp in her lap, perfect makeup smeared with tears. "Mom." Emily's voice rang out unexpectedly loud in the sudden silence. "Did you really want to kill Dad? For a movie role?" That childlike question, asked in the midst of this massive scandal, was the final straw. Sarah collapsed in her seat, her shoulders shaking with sobs. The perfect edifice of her new life crumbled like a house of cards. Within an hour, every major news outlet was running the story. Hendricks' empire falls, the headlines screamed. Sex, lies, and casting calls, shocking expose of Hollywood producer. I watched as police escorted Hendricks from the building. His face, usually arrogant and assured, now showed the bewilderment of a man whose world had suddenly imploded. Sarah followed him, no longer a proud, rising star, but a broken woman who'd lost everything. "You know what I learned from all this, Dad?" Emily stood beside me, watching this parade of fallen angels. That talent and honesty still matter more than connections and money. I hugged my daughter, feeling something new growing inside, not gloating, not triumph, but a quiet certainty that justice exists. Maybe not always swift, not always obvious, but inevitable. #epilogue. 6 months later, tabloids were still plastered with headlines about the Hendricks case. 342 women filed a class action lawsuit against the former producer, demanding compensation for destroyed careers and broken lives. His empire collapsed.